In the rolling hills of upstate New York, a religious community once built its entire future on a promise that guaranteed it would have no future at all. The Shakers, formerly called the United Society of Believers in Christ's Second Appearing, grew from a handful of immigrants into 19 settlements spread across 8 states, took in thousands of converts over 2 centuries, and left behind farms, furniture, and hymns still studied today. But every person who joined took a vow of celibacy the moment they signed the covenant. That single rule meant the direct family line for many converts stopped the day they walked through the gate, and yet the surnames those converts carried did not disappear from America. They lived on through brothers, sisters, cousins, and children born before conversion, people who stayed in the world the Shakers had left behind. Some of these families never knew what their relative had joined, and some spent generations quietly aware of a strange chapter buried somewhere in the family story, mentioned only in passing at holiday dinners or half remembered from an old relative's stories. If your family tree runs through New York, Kentucky, Ohio, or Maine sometime in the 1700s or 1800s, there is a real chance one of these names sits somewhere on a branch you have never traced. Here are the surnames tied to the Shaker movement, and what actually happened to the families who carried them once the person who made the name famous walked away from ordinary life for good. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand why these names still matter, it helps to know where the movement began. Anne Lee was born in Manchester, England in 1736, the daughter of a blacksmith, and she went to work in the textile mills before she was old enough to read. In her 20s, she joined a small group known locally as the Shaking Quakers, led by James and Jane Wardley, who worshipped through trembling, shouting, and physical movement they believed carried the presence of God. Lee married a blacksmith named Abraham Standerin, sometimes recorded as Stanley, and gave birth to 4 children, and all 4 died in infancy or early childhood. That loss reportedly convinced her that sexual relations and childbirth itself stood between believers and salvation. By the 1770s, she was leading the group herself, and in 1774 she sailed to New York with 8 followers, including her husband, her brother William Lee, and a young man named James Whittaker. English authorities had grown hostile to the group by then, and several members had already been jailed for disrupting church services, so the voyage to America was as much an escape as it was a mission. They settled first in Manhattan, then moved north to a patch of wilderness near Albany called Niskayuna, later renamed Watervliet, where they cleared land and built the first Shaker settlement in America. Anne Lee died in 1784, worn down by years of travel and, according to Shaker accounts, physical abuse from crowds hostile to her preaching. James Whittaker led the society for a few years afterward, and when he died in 1787, a New England-born convert named Joseph Meacham took over and gave the movement the structure it would keep for the next century: organized villages, shared property, and pairs of male and female elders running every level of leadership together. Meacham's successor, Lucy Wright, led through the years of fastest growth, including a push west after news reached New Lebanon of a religious revival sweeping Kentucky in 1801. 3 missionaries walked more than 1,000 miles to investigate it, and what they found turned into new Shaker communities in Ohio and Kentucky within a few years. At its peak in the mid-1800s, the society counted several thousand members across those 19 villages, running farms, seed businesses, and furniture workshops that supplied customers far beyond their own communities. Then it began to shrink. There was no next generation born inside the walls. Orphans the Shakers raised often left as adults once they came of age, and industrial jobs pulled young converts toward cities instead of communal farms. By the 20th century, only a few communities remained occupied, and today a small group still lives at Sabbath Day Lake in Maine, the last active Shaker community in the world. Central to all of this was a belief that Mother Anne Lee herself represented the second coming of Christ in female form, completing a spiritual pattern the Shakers believed had started with Jesus and needed a woman to finish. That belief is part of why the society insisted on pairing a male and a female elder at every level of leadership, from the smallest local family up to the central ministry at New Lebanon. It also explains why so many converts joining as married couples had to split into separate households the moment they signed the covenant, since the same rule that elevated women to equal spiritual authority also required men and women alike to give up marriage entirely. Understanding that belief matters for tracing these surnames, because it explains why whole families sometimes join together, why husbands and wives who arrived together nonetheless produced no more children afterward, and why so many of the names on this list run into the same genealogical wall at exactly the moment of conversion. It also explains the steady stream of converts who kept the population going even without any births at all. Shaker communities actively recruited during religious revivals, took in widows and widowers with nowhere else to turn, and accepted entire families during hard economic years, when communal living meant guaranteed food, shelter, and work, which is part of why the movement kept growing for decades despite a rule that made growth from within completely impossible. Consider the name Lee itself. Anne Lee's brother William sailed with her in 1774 and remained at her side for the rest of his life, and he never married, dying within the society, which meant his branch of the family ended exactly where Anne Lee's did. But Anne Lee had other relatives back in Manchester who never left England and never joined the Shaking Quakers at all. Historical accounts describe a working-class Lee family tied to the textile trade in Manchester, most of whom lived and died as ordinary laborers with no connection to the religious movement their sister and brother had joined an ocean away. Their descendants, if any survive, would carry the Lee name today, with no idea that a famous American religious founder once shared their family tree. Lee is also one of the most common surnames in the English-speaking world, which makes tracing any single line back to Manchester in the 1700s difficult without detailed parish records. Still, genealogists researching Anne Lee's ancestry have used baptismal and marriage records for Lees in the Manchester area from that period, giving modern researchers with roots in Lancashire mill towns a starting point worth checking. The larger lesson sits right in the founder's own family. The Shakers were built around the idea that biological family mattered less than spiritual family, yet the very first Shaker household shows how thoroughly those two things stayed tangled together. Anne Lee gave up her marriage and her children's memory to build a religious movement, while her wider family carried on in Manchester factories, unaware their name would end up printed in American history books 250 years later. James Whittaker was among the original 8 who crossed the Atlantic with Anne Lee, and within Shaker history he holds a special place as one of the first English converts to see Lee's teaching take root on American soil. He never married, and as far as Shaker records show, fathered no children before he joined the group in Manchester as a teenager. That makes his branch of the Whittaker line a near dead end in the direct genealogical sense, since there were no children to trace in the first place. He became the second leader of the society after Anne Lee's death in 1784, overseeing construction of the first formal meeting house at New Lebanon, New York, a building whose gambrel roof design became a Shaker architectural signature copied at nearly every community built afterward. Whittaker died young, in 1787, only 3 years into his leadership, and Joseph Meacham took over the structural work he had started, but the Whittaker surname did not vanish from America because of him. Whittaker was already a widespread name across the north of England by the 18th century, tied to the wool and textile trade in Lancashire and Yorkshire, and thousands of Whittaker families emigrated to the United States entirely independent of any Shaker connection, settling in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and the mid-Atlantic states through the 1800s. Anyone researching a Whittaker line rooted in English textile towns of that period may find themselves reading the same parish registers that historians have combed through looking for James Whittaker's own origins, without the two families being related at all. A name showing up in Shaker history does not automatically mean a family connection. Sometimes it just means two families happen to come from the same crowded corner of England at the same crowded moment in time. John Hocknell was not related to Anne Lee at all, but without his money, the Shakers might never have reached America in the first place. He was a well-off farmer and landowner from Cheshire, England, one of the wealthier converts to join the Shaking Quakers, and it was Hocknell who paid for the ship passage that carried Anne Lee's small band across the Atlantic in 1774. He brought his teenage son Richard along with him, and his wife Hannah made the crossing too, though she reportedly found the celibate life impossible to accept and returned to England not long afterward, leaving her husband and son behind in the new settlement. Hocknell later used his own money again to purchase the land near Niskayuna that became the first Shaker home in America, effectively founding the physical center of the entire movement out of his personal fortune. He remained a committed Shaker for the rest of his life and died within the society, meaning his own household inside the movement produced no further generation, much like Whittaker's. Hannah Hocknell's decision to sail home changes the picture completely, though. If she remarried or had other children after returning to Cheshire, any Hocknell descendants tracing through her would have grown up entirely outside the religious movement her husband and son gave their lives to, quite possibly never learning that a relative had once financed one of early America's strangest religious migrations. Hocknell is a rarer surname than most on this list, concentrated historically in Cheshire and the surrounding counties of northwest England, which means a documented Hocknell line surfacing in American records has a reasonable chance of connecting back to exactly this family, whether through Richard's branch, which ended inside the Shaker order, or through relatives who stayed in England the whole time. Joseph Meacham grew up in Enfield, Connecticut, and had been a New Light Baptist preacher before encountering Ann Lee's teaching around 1780, and he brought a talent for organization that the young Shaker movement badly needed. After Whittaker's death in 1787, Meacham restructured the entire society, establishing the format of gathered families living under one roof, common ownership of property, and the dual leadership of a male and female elder at every level, a structure that lasted as long as the Shakers did. He also formally organized the practice of receiving orphans and poor children into Shaker care, a policy that filled the communities with new members generation after generation, even without anyone being born inside the walls. Meacham never married after joining the Shakers, since that was the whole point of joining, and biographers disagree on how much of his early life as a traveling preacher survives in any real detail. What is clearer is that Meacham had brothers back in Enfield, and Connecticut town records from the period show a Meacham family established there since the early 1700s, well before Joseph was born. Descendants of that wider Meacham family, uninvolved in the religious movement one relative helped design, continued farming and working in Connecticut, and later spread into New York and the Midwest, along with much of New England's westward migration. If your family history runs through early Connecticut River Valley towns, a Meacham branch may well predate the Shaker movement by generations, tracing back to English settlers with no connection to the religion at all. Meacham's own leadership style, careful and methodical rather than charismatic, shaped how thoroughly the Shakers documented themselves going forward, which is part of why so much detailed record-keeping about later converts even exists for historians and genealogists to search through today. Lucy Wright became the first woman to lead the entire Shaker Society after Meacham's death in 1796, a position she held for 25 years and used to expand the movement further than either of her predecessors had managed. She was born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, married a man named Elizur Goodrich Wright before joining the Shakers as a young married woman, and like every Shaker convert, she gave up conjugal life the moment she signed the covenant. Elizur Wright joined the Shakers alongside her, and the couple had no biological children either before or after their conversion, which meant that particular Wright household ended without any direct descendants at all. The Wright surname, however, was already common across New England by the late 1700s, tracing to some of the earliest English colonists who settled Massachusetts and Connecticut in the 1600s. Elizur Wright had extended family scattered through Massachusetts who had no interest in Shaker theology and continued ordinary colonial and early American life, raising families the way every other household did, working the same fields their ancestors had cleared generations earlier. Under Lucy Wright's leadership, the society reached its widest geographic spread, and her personal correspondence, much of which survives in Shaker archives today, shows a leader who corresponded constantly with converts and their worldly relatives alike, keeping the movement connected to families it had technically left behind. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Wright ranks among the more common surnames in American genealogical records for exactly that reason, an old, widespread English name rather than one narrowly tied to a single family, so a Wright ancestor appearing in 18th century Massachusetts records is more likely connected to that broad colonial population than to Lucy Wright's specific household. Still, for anyone whose family tree includes a Wright branch from the Berkshires or the Connecticut River Valley during the 1790s, it is a line worth checking against Shaker community records, since Lucy Wright's years of leadership drew in relatives and neighbors from exactly that region. Issachar Bates had already lived an entire worldly life before he ever heard a Shaker sermon. As a boy, he served as a drummer during the American Revolutionary War, and by the time he encountered Shaker missionaries preaching in New Lebanon, New York, he was a grown husband and father of several children. Unlike Whittaker or Wright, he brought that entire worldly history into the movement with him, instead of encountering it as a young single convert. He and his wife, Lavina, along with their children, joined together as a family in 1801, and from that point on, Bates lived by the same celibate arrangement as every other Shaker, housed separately from his wife under the same roof, but as spiritual siblings rather than a married couple. 4 years later, in 1805, the Shaker ministry sent Bates west on foot, alongside Benjamin Seth Youngs and John Meacham, to investigate reports of a massive religious revival sweeping Kentucky. The three men walked well over 1,000 miles, preaching along the way, and within a year, their reports led to the founding of Union Village in Ohio, followed by Pleasant Hill and South Union in Kentucky. Bates spent the rest of his working life establishing and running those Western communities, and he became one of the Shaker's most prolific hymn writers, credited with hundreds of songs still sung at Shaker worship services today. His children present the more complicated genealogical picture. Shaker membership records show that some of Bates's sons and daughters remained in the society into adulthood and signed the covenant themselves, ending their branch of the family the same way their father's household in the world had ended. Others left as young adults, married outside the community, and had children of their own, carrying the Bates name into the next generation in the ordinary way that every other American family did. Anyone tracing a Bates ancestor through early Kentucky or Ohio counties near old Shaker land in the early 1800s may be looking at exactly that kind of split family, part of it ending inside a Shaker village and part of it continuing in the world outside. Bates himself lived into his 80s, long enough to see the Western communities he had helped found grow into some of the largest in the entire society. Benjamin Seth Youngs was the youngest of the three missionaries sent west in 1805, and he turned out to be the movement's most important theologian, writing a book called The Testimony of Christ's Second Appearing, published in 1808, that laid out Shaker doctrine more thoroughly than anything written before it. The Youngs family had roots on Long Island and in the Hudson Valley of New York, going back to the early Dutch and English colonial period, and Benjamin joined the society as a young unmarried man, meaning his own direct line stopped the same way Whittaker's had. The wider Youngs family in New York continued on completely apart from Shaker involvement, farming and trading through the Hudson Valley for generations, and the name spread into New England and later the Midwest as families moved west looking for cheaper land. Youngs is spelled several ways in old records, sometimes as Young and sometimes as Youngs with the final S, and that spelling inconsistency is common enough in 18th and 19th century documents that genealogists researching either version of the name often end up looking at the very same families. Benjamin Seth Youngs eventually left New Lebanon to help run the Western communities his own missionary work had founded, spending much of his later life at Union Village in Ohio and then South Union in Kentucky, remaining a committed Shaker theologian for the rest of his long life, and continuing to write and revise Shaker doctrine well into old age, training a younger generation of Western elders who would run those communities long after he was gone. Richard McNemar took a much stranger road into the Shaker movement than any of the others on this list. He was an ordained Presbyterian minister in Ohio and a leading voice of the Cane Ridge Revival, the same 1801 religious event in Kentucky that Shaker missionaries had walked 1,000 miles to investigate. McNemar preached a version of frontier revivalism so intense that his own Presbyterian synod put him on trial for heresy, and rather than recant, he broke away entirely, eventually meeting the visiting Shaker missionaries and converting along with a large portion of his own congregation in 1805. He brought his wife and children into the movement with him, and his conversion supplied Union Village, Ohio, with much of its early leadership and its most literate defender, since McNemar wrote a widely read account of the Kentucky Revival that is still cited by historians of American religion today. Some of his children stayed inside the Shaker order for the rest of their lives, while others, based on surviving community membership records, chose to leave once they reached adulthood and were no longer bound by decisions their parents had made for them as minors. Those who left carried the McNemar name back into ordinary American life across Ohio and Indiana. Because McNemar arrived already an educated, well-known public figure, his conversion drew far more outside attention than most, and newspaper accounts from the period occasionally mention McNemar relatives who never joined the Shakers at all, disapproving of the choice from a distance while sharing the same last name as one of the movement's most important intellectual converts. McNemar kept writing and revising Shaker theological texts for decades after his conversion, and some of his surviving letters describe correspondence with Presbyterian relatives who never forgave him for abandoning the ministry. A rare case where the split between a Shaker convert and his worldly family shows up directly in written record rather than having to be pieced together from parish registers alone. Henry Clay Blinn represents a different generation of Shaker convert altogether, born in 1824 in Providence, Rhode Island, decades after Ann Lee's death and long after the founding generation had passed on. He joined the Shaker community at Canterbury, New Hampshire as a teenager in the 1830s, and unlike most of the names on this list, he lived to see the society's slow decline firsthand rather than its early growth. Blinn trained as a dentist and printer, ran the community's press, and became one of the most careful record keepers the Shakers ever produced, documenting daily life at Canterbury in journals that historians still rely on for accurate detail about how these communities actually function day to day. He also wrote a detailed history of the early Shaker missionary journeys, preserving accounts of Bates, Youngs, and McNemar's original trip west that might otherwise have been lost to time. Blinn never married, having joined as a child raised in the society rather than as a convert who left an adult life behind, and no direct descendants traced to him at all. The Blinn surname has documented roots in colonial Rhode Island, going back to the 1600s, tied to early English settlers around Providence, and Blinn families with no connection whatsoever to the Shaker movement continued living ordinary lives across New England throughout the same period Henry Clay Blinn spent at Canterbury. Because Blinn was placed in Shaker care as a young child rather than converting as an adult, his own biological family history before entering the community is harder to trace than that of converts like Bates or McNemar, who arrived with a documented spouse and children already in hand. That gap itself is a common feature of Shaker genealogy. Children raised from a young age inside the community sometimes have thinner paper trails connecting them back to a birth family than adult converts do, since the adoption and placement records kept by 19th century religious societies were not always as thorough as the birth and marriage records kept in the world outside. Frederick William Evans grew up in Bromyard, England, born in 1808, and before he ever heard of the Shakers, he was deeply involved in radical political movements, including the ideas of the Welsh social reformer Robert Owen. Evans emigrated to the United States as a young man and joined the Shaker community at Mount Lebanon, New York in 1830, eventually becoming one of the most publicly visible Shaker elders of the 19th century, someone journalists and politicians sought out for interviews about Shaker theology, pacifism, and communal living. He never married after joining, and no children carried his direct line forward from inside the society. But Frederick Evans had a brother, George Henry Evans, who stayed in the world and became one of the most influential labor and land reform activists in 19th century America, editing a newspaper called The Working Man's Advocate and campaigning for years to make government land available to settlers, work that helped build public support for what eventually became the Homestead Act. Two brothers, born in the same English town, ended up shaping American history through completely separate paths, one from inside a celibate religious community and one from the middle of the labor movement in New York City. Descendants of George Henry Evans carried the Evans name forward in the ordinary way, through marriage and children, entirely independent of the religious movement his brother helped lead, and some of them went on to become labor organizers and newspapermen in their own right, following a family talent for public advocacy that clearly ran in more than one direction. Of every name on this list, the Evans brothers make the clearest case that a surname tied to the Shakers did not vanish so much as it kept living somewhere else, in a life the historical spotlight simply pointed away from. Every one of these names shows the same pattern from a slightly different angle. The Shakers built a religious life specifically designed to end genetically with each person who joined it, and in a narrow sense, that plan worked exactly as intended. Nobody was born inside a Shaker village who grew up to have Shaker grandchildren, because that outcome was structurally impossible from the moment the covenant was signed, but almost none of these converts arrived without a family behind them first. They had parents, siblings, cousins, and sometimes spouses and children of their own, and every one of those relatives kept living an ordinary American or English life, untouched by the vow their relative had taken. Lee, Whittaker, Hocknell, Meacham, Wright, Bates, Youngs, McNemar, Blinn, and Evans never disappeared from American genealogy. They just stopped showing up in Shaker meeting houses and kept showing up everywhere else, in Ohio farmhouses, Connecticut river towns, New York labor newspapers, and English mill villages, largely unaware that a relative's decision 2 centuries ago would eventually turn a shared last name into a footnote of American religious history. Only a handful of Shakers remain today, living at Sabbath Day Lake in Maine, the last active community left from what was once a movement of thousands. But the families these converts came from never stopped growing, and their descendants are almost certainly still out there, carrying names that sound familiar for reasons they have never had a chance to trace. Some of those descendants have spent years digging through census records and parish registers without ever landing on the Shaker connection sitting a few branches back, chasing down every ordinary lead except the one that actually explains the gap in the record. Part of the reason these connections stay hidden is that Shaker communities kept their own separate membership rolls, journals, and correspondence, much of it now preserved in archives at places like the New York Public Library, the Winterthur Library, and various state historical societies, rather than filed alongside ordinary birth, marriage, and death records. A researcher searching only the standard genealogical databases can easily miss a relative who spent decades at New Lebanon, Canterbury, or Union Village, simply because that relative's later life was recorded in a completely separate set of documents, kept privately by the community itself, rather than filed anywhere a typical search would ever reach. Cross-referencing a family surname against those Shaker archives, alongside the usual census and church records, is often the only way these two record-keeping worlds end up connected at all. Maybe one of these names is sitting on your own family tree right now, waiting for someone to finally look in the right place. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.